you, Ellen. Let's get started for our closing plenary speaker. I am thrilled and honored to introduce our closing plenary speaker, Dean Kimberly Mutcherson, who unfortunately couldn't join us today because she got sick a few days ago and yet graciously offered to do this over Zoom. We are so grateful, but we were really eager to have her speak, whether it was going to be virtual or in person, because she's such a wonderful speaker. Kimberly Mutcherson is co-dean and professor of law at Rutgers Law School in Camden, New Jersey. She is a renowned reproductive justice scholar focusing on assisted reproduction, abortion, and maternal fetal decision-making, among other topics. In 2020, Cambridge University Press published her edited volume, Feminist Judgments, Reproductive Justice Rewritten. In 2021, Dean Mutcherson received the Association of American Law School Inaugural Impact Award as a co-founder of the Law Dean Antitrust Clearinghouse Project. It was a really fantastic project that was so helpful. She received the Center for Reproductive Rights Innovation and Scholarship in 2013 and a Chancellor's Teaching Excellence Award in 2011. And the Women's Law Caucus Faculty Appreciation Award in 2011 and 2014. We are so thrilled to have her speak today and help us think about how we can move forward after many dark comments that were made earlier today. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm really appreciative, and I'm so sorry not to be there in person. I was trying to rally and then decided nobody wants to be around a coughing person in this day and age. So I'm really grateful that I got to watch so much of the conference from afar. I've been tuning in on Zoom yesterday and today. And the first thing that I want to say is just to praise the organizers. That the work that went into this is so obviously at a very high level, and the lineup of speakers is just incredibly impressive. So it's a real honor for me to be able to be here with you all this afternoon. And even without physically being in the space, I could just sort of feel the energy that was floating around, that was being generated by so many smart and thoughtful and compassionate people being in conversation with each other, which I think is exactly what we need right now. And I hope, and I certainly feel like there will be some productive collaborations that are going to come out of this event, which has been really just a treasure trove of knowledge and expertise. So as a closing plenary speaker, I feel like my task is to try to pull together threads from across various conversations that have happened during the conference, and I definitely want to do that. But I also want to share some of my thoughts about how we can move forward in this moment that I actually think is full of promise, obviously full of peril as well, but also full of promise. And in particular, I want to stress the importance of rooting our work in reproductive justice, not just in name, but actually in practice as we use it. I will also stress that I have been sort of building this talk as the conference has progressed. Like I said, I wanted to hear what people were saying and be responsive to folks. So might sound a little bit more disjointed than what I usually deliver. So I hope that you will bear with me on that. I also know that I stand between you and life outside of the room that you've been sitting in for this entire day. So Sonia was nice enough to suggest that I could speak for a while, but then also do some Q&A and make it more interactive. So I'm definitely planning to do that. And the way I really want to do this is I'm going to start with some sort of bigger ideas that I took from both panels at this conference and other conversations that I've had in the months since Dobbs, with some of you who are in that room there, because we've been kind of on a circuit of conferences lately. And then I want to move on to some more sort of concrete thoughts about action. So here are the big ideas. And some of this is super obvious, and I'm okay with that. I always say to my students, sometimes you have to say the obvious things out loud. So white women with class privilege remain second-class citizens in this country, and second-class citizenship is still aspirational for many marginalized women, including women of color, poor women, trans women, young women, undocumented immigrants, and women who are incarcerated, women who are living with disabilities. Obviously, not new information for anyone who is hearing my voice right now, but I think it's really important that we not ignore the larger picture, the larger milieu in which we are working. We are having these conversations about abortion because politicians in this country continue to believe that women's bodies are a thing to be regulated. We are having these conversations because women are still treated as though having babies is our primary purpose in life. We're having these conversations because conservative politicians are trying to convince us that abortion bans are about protecting women rather than punishing us for not accepting our natural rules, or God forbid, for having sex for something other than procreation. We're having these conversations because too many people in this country aren't willing to have the very painful conversations that we need to have about our history of abuse of Black and brown bodies, especially Black and brown women's bodies. And we're having these conversations because white supremacy and fear of the shifting racial demographics in the US remain a significant driver of law and public policy in our country. Now, as a lawyer, I obviously understand that we have to craft different narratives for different audiences, but we also have to be prepared to call out the gaslighting that helped to get us to where we are now. The gaslighting that Roe was safe and that people saying otherwise were just being hysterical women. We've been proven right. The gaslighting that abortion bans would not target women or pregnant people for punishment, only providers. We've been proven right. And the gaslighting that a movement organized around the concept of choice without problematizing what choice means in a society of rampant inequality could ever be a movement for all of us. So as I think about this moment, as I think about this moment that we're in now, I think about the enslaved women who were tortured by Dr. Marion Sims, the father of gynecology, in horrific experiments that they had no choice about participating in. I'm thinking about the thousands of Black women, women with disabilities, Puerto Rican and Chicana women, Indigenous women, incarcerated women, and others who have been and continue to be subject to sterilization abuse and denied the choice to have children. And I'm thinking about the horrifying stories that Michelle Goodwin shared with us yesterday about how women and children have been traditionally and presently undervalued in this country and who could not choose to flee from men who violated them in a range of awful ways. So we really have to understand this moment within the broader context of history so that we don't simply keep repeating past mistakes or embracing solutions that cannot ever get us free. And we must spread that history because too many of our children are being raised in homes or communities that are currently fixated on protecting children, by which they mean white children, from the reality of racial terror in our nation. So that's the sort of broader context in which I'm thinking about all of these issues: the historical context, the present context, the systemic racism, the homophobia, the sexism, all of it. But now I want to sort of dig down a little bit, get a little bit more concrete. So I want to switch from the broad to some other thoughts about organizing and about action. In addition to just absolutely loving the interdisciplinarity of this conference, I just think it's so productive. I also love that this conference has been full of academic activists, people who aren't just interested in theorizing about the world, but who are doing work with the goal of having a positive impact on the lives of others. Academic activists are by far my favorite kind of academics. And as an academic activist myself, I am really doing my best to see this moment in which see this as a moment in which we can push for better rather than try to claw our way back to status quo. And as those who know me and those who've heard me speak recently know, this idea of trying to be optimistic actually takes a lot out of me, but I'm working on it. So Roe was weak, Casey was weaker. Neither of those cases was a reproductive justice case. They were about reproductive rights, and even more narrowly, they were about abortion. They were not about women. They were not about equality. They were not about race. They were not about class. They were incredibly narrow. And so if we have to rebuild, and that's exactly what we're doing, right? We are rebuilding. We should dream big and we should push for better. This means, as I've already stressed, that we need to move forward under the banner of reproductive justice, not just reproductive rights. And I have just been heartened to see how many folks are using the language of justice in this moment and at this conference. And I hope that we're all going to put our money where our mouths are and support RJ organizations that have been doing incredible work on the ground for decades, in some cases, with a fraction of the resources available to mainstream reproductive rights organizations. I worry a great deal in this moment that it's the big organizations that are reaping the financial benefits of a life without Roe, while the smaller grassroots groups that are embedded in communities are going to continue to struggle. We have to do better as individuals as we decide where we're going to put our money, and we have to ask funders to do the same. We also need to take this moment to ensure that we are focused on all three pillars of the reproductive justice movement: the right to have a child, to not have a child, and to raise one's children in safe and healthy environments. And that the principles that undergird reproductive justice are at the forefront of our work. Now, from my perspective, the essential beauty of RJ is that it is a movement that demands coalition. You cannot achieve reproductive justice without working with people from other movements. So RJ encompasses environmental justice, criminal justice reform, education reform, healthcare reform, the end of income inequality, expansion of voting rights, abolishing the inequities of the child welfare system, and on and on and on. As such, the groups with which we must be aligned are many. And some of the bedfellows we find ourselves working with might be strange. And I want to tell you a little story to stress what I'm talking about when I think about those strange bedfellows. Not so long ago, I attended a conference at Radcliffe, which was one of those let's bring together both sides so we can try and find common ground type of conferences. I usually don't go to those conferences. I don't find them to be productive. But there were a couple of speakers at this conference that I just found to be incredibly powerful in the way that they articulated their openness to partnering across differences. And their presentations really resonated with me. Now, the first one was a Black woman who is a totally grassroots organizer. She works in Mississippi and provides a range of sort of wraparound services to Black women, from helping women identify where they can get abortions or access to contraception, to helping them get diapers and formula, or helping them get out of abusive relationships, just sort of all of it. And she was there sort of to represent the pro-choice side. A second speaker was a woman who came the next day, who was a Latina academic who works in ethics. And she identified herself as pro-life. And as far as I could tell, she's somebody who would probably describe herself as an academic activist as well. And she talked very passionately and candidly about the limitations of the pro-life movement, especially the racism that is found there, or the blindness to race, and the ways in which that movement has failed to embrace a more expansive reproductive justice type notion of what it means to be pro-life. So for instance, she was talking about kids in cages and immigration reform, and why wouldn't the pro-life movement take up issues like that? Now, maybe other people have heard a self-described pro-life person talk about allegiance to the idea of reproductive justice, but for me, it was kind of a first. And what really moved me about both of these speakers, both of whom were just incredibly compelling, was that they both spoke very explicitly about their desire to work with other people, regardless of the labels that they wore, right? Whether pro-choice or pro-life, who cared about issues like maternal mortality and morbidity, about infant mortality, about housing insecurity, about food insecurity, immigration reform, intimate partner violence, sexual assault, affordable childcare, all of it. Now, I don't know how big the pool is, but I don't doubt that there is a space for collaborative efforts across differences in beliefs about abortion that can accrue to the benefit of those who are the most vulnerable among us. I'm guessing that those collaborations would not always be comfortable for a whole host of reasons. But even so, this feels like a time when we should be seeking them out. Plus, even asking for those collaborations exposes the hypocrisy of those who wave the pro-life banner, but who would watch women die from mismanaged abortions, who would provide greater protection from harm for a fetus than for a child sitting in a classroom, or who believe that the answer to forcing more poor women to carry pregnancies to term is to beef up their state's foster care system. Pointing out hypocrisy doesn't always win the day. That is obvious from the political structure in which we have been living for quite some time, but it's worth a shot, particularly in cases where there are lives at stake, and that is definitely where we are right now. Another set of partners in a similar but not identical vein are those in the infertility community, providers and advocates and patients. Working with these folks is a necessary way to broaden our base of power. And some of that discussion was happening in our last panel as well. Previous defeats of personhood bills have taken the combined force of abortion advocates and the infertility community, groups who I have long argued should be natural allies, but often have not been, largely because of abortion stigma. As states come closer to declaring embryos to be people, folks in the infertility community are not going to have the luxury to wall themselves off from abortion stigma. So reproductive endocrinologists or other physicians who perform selective reductions in a world without Casey's prohibition on pre-viability bans may find themselves in the untenable positions when a patient is what I sometimes refer to as too pregnant, right? Even somebody who is pregnant with twins and wants a singleton, can you selectively reduce in that set of circumstances? Issues of informed consent, when a patient's only choices for embryos is use them for yourself or give them to someone else to use. That creates a very tricky landscape, and one that I don't think most of these providers want to navigate. And it sounds like something that would never happen, right? That we would live in a world in which a state would say, if you're not going to use your embryos, we will give them to somebody else. First of all, the fact that the entire concept of embryo adoption exists tells us, one, that this is already a practice. Two, George Bush II actually had an initiative around embryo adoption when he was president. And three, we've had states like Arizona that have passed statutes specifically to try to ensure that in embryo disputes, embryos go to the person who is most likely to bring an embryo to fruition. So it is the case, as somebody said, that states have not had a lot of regulation of infertility treatment, and yet there is this space here where the floodgates potentially could open. What I worry about in that context, and this is going to sound very selfish, and I'm going to accept that, is that what we might see is advocates for infertility care who work really hard to carve themselves out of any kind of statute, right? Whether it is an abortion ban or anything else that potentially impacts their ability to do their work and the patients with whom they get to work. And I would say, and again, this is why it's super selfish, that we need to work really hard to not let them do that, right? There's much more power when we fight these issues together than when we allow one group to free itself from the shackles that are being created for others. We should be working with criminal justice reform advocates as we think about the issues of criminalization, whether of self-managed abortion or perceived self-managed abortions, attempts to criminalize travel, expanded attempts to criminalize any behavior during pregnancy that potentially causes risk to a fetus. The best way to battle those issues is to work with people who are already working within our deeply flawed criminal justice system. And certainly we all know that our overflowing prisons don't need any more residents. And we also know that most women who are terminating pregnancies already have children at home. And so when we arrest them, we create all sorts of collateral consequences, everything from what happens to their children. Do their children go into substitute care? If they get convicted, are they going to be able to have access to public housing? All sorts of things that flow from that. There are also lots of other categories of people and professions whose feet we really need to be holding to the fire in the days, weeks, months, and years to come. And I'm not going to try to give a comprehensive list, but I want to share a few more specific thoughts that I have before I wrap up. So first, going back to the idea of working within the RJ frame. RJ is human rights based. And one of the great things about human rights is that they are often positive rights. I actually teach a class on South African constitution law, which I'm teaching right now at my law school. And one of the things that is incredibly difficult for my students to embrace is the idea that you could have a constitution that says things like the government owes you an education, the government owes you healthcare, the government owes you a clean environment. They're they find it very difficult to accept that. And yet that's what RJ says to us, right? That we need to be thinking in a human rights way, not just in a civil or constitutional rights way. So we need to be focused not just on what the government can't do to us, but what the government owes us. As has already been said at this conference, rights without access are really not rights at all. So as we're demanding protections for abortion access in abortion sanctuary states, let's not be satisfied with just making abortion legal. In states like New Jersey, which is where I happen to be right now and where I live, that are rapidly protecting abortion, we need to simultaneously be demanding high quality pre and postnatal care for those who want to carry pregnancies to term, because the maternal mortality rates in New Jersey, especially but not just for Black women, are abysmal. And we must and can do better. Again, we should not simply be trying to work our way back to Roe, because Roe was never, ever enough. Let's stress the importance of funding for procedures, but also for travel, for lodging, for childcare, maybe even to replace lost income, right? Think big. And because I've heard her do it several times, and I hope she's still in the room, I want to give a plug for the DC Abortion Fund on behalf of Hannah, right? In those states where we have friendly legislatures, let's also push for comprehensive access to contraception, including for minors, robust sex education in schools, high quality, affordable childcare for all parents, adult or minors, rigorous enforcement of protections against pregnancy discrimination, especially for women who are doing low-wage work, the end of parental notification and consent requirements, broadening of categories of healthcare providers who can perform abortions, and more assistance for fertility care for people who cannot afford it. I really want to emphasize that last point because the focus on avoiding pregnancy has often stood in the way of protecting the right to become pregnant for women who are not white. Speaking specifically about Black women, we know that Black women have higher rates of infertility, lower rates of access to infertility care, even in states with insurance mandates, and less likelihood of success when they do use infertility treatment. If Medicaid is so willing to pay for sterilizations for poor women, why shouldn't it also provide fertility care for those women? As discussed in the second panel today, we also need better privacy protections because privacy is a privilege for lots of folks and not as available to people who don't have the financial resources or whose ability to keep their information to themselves is compromised by their involvement with the child welfare, criminal justice, or immigration systems. Now, I could go on, but the point is this: if we keep asking for crumbs, that is all we are ever going to get, and it is nowhere close to what we deserve. RJ also requires us to root our work in intersectionality in the true sense of that word as coined by Kim Crenshaw. When she was writing about intersectionality, she was writing in the tradition of the Black feminist authors who had written before her and really focused on the experiences of Black women for whom sitting at the intersection of Blackness and femaleness meant that our experiences of discrimination and oppression were not simply about being Black or simply about being female, but came from the very specific experience of being a Black female in spaces where that unique identity was meaningful. So intersectionality is not just about people having multiple identities, and we need to do better about thinking about intersectionality in very sophisticated ways. This doesn't mean that we should be speaking for women who have complex identities or others with complex identities, but that we should be learning from those people and providing opportunities for them to advocate for themselves and for what they need. Sorry. RJ is rooted in the experiences of women of color. So importantly, it does not center the experiences of white women, but places the experiences of those who often sit at the furthest margins in the center. We know that when we protect white women, lots of women get left out of that protection. But when we protect women of color and other marginalized women, white women tend to benefit from that work, oftentimes more so than women of color. We can't just know this theoretically, we have to believe it, and we have to root our activism in it. This means understanding that choice is a privilege, as we've already talked about, that frequently has a class component. And it means that legality is just a start. It means demanding that our healthcare providers are trained to understand how their own biases impact the care they are providing to patients. The outcomes for Black babies and Black mamas should not improve if they are receiving care from Black healthcare providers. They should get high quality care no matter who is providing that care. Those providers should be careful not to offer permanent sterilization as a first step for avoiding pregnancy for poor women of color because the doctor doesn't trust that she'll make good decisions about contraception. And when we have those enlightened healthcare providers, we need to teach them to be advocates, not just in medical settings, but in the spaces where laws and policies are made. I am thrilled to see medical schools adding advocacy classes to their curricula, and I hope that it's a trend that expands. It means ensuring that people who need care are not afraid to access it because they can't trust that their providers won't use the information they share to initiate criminal or child welfare proceedings. As I was listening to Kiara Bridges in the opening plenary yesterday, I appreciated her very succinct phrase, and I thought somebody should put it on a t-shirt: doctors are snitches. Healthcare providers who snitch can be a serious danger to their patients. It means asking hospital lawyers to have a bit more backbone and protect their patients and providers against laws that are causing harm. Dead women are not an acceptable casualty of a desire to be overly cautious. All women deserve to be provided with the standard of care, no matter the state in which they are receiving that care. And similarly to the point that I just made about intersectionality, RJ recognizes that reproductive oppression is experienced differently across communities of color and other marginalized communities. People are complex, our lives are complex, our identities are complex, and we need to constantly be mindful of that reality. I don't have to be you in order to try to understand what you're telling me about how it is to live in your body. And I don't have to completely understand what you tell me in order to respect it and respect you. Within our movements, we must hold ourselves to account for our own racism, paternalism or maternalism, our elitism, our transphobia, our xenophobia, and other forms of oppression that keep us from doing the work the way that it should and needs to be done. Had the mainstream repro rights movement gotten on board faster with the need to understand voting rights as integral to reproductive rights and justice, a point that Black RJ activists in the South had been making for many, many years, we might not be in as difficult a position as we are in now. So I want to wind down where I started, which is really thinking about and talking about RJ. We are at the start of something that has the potential to be absolutely transformative. RJ, again, tells us that every mother, every parent deserves to be able to raise her children in safe and healthy environments. But we know that across a whole host of measures, Black people are less well off in this country than white people. And we know from abortion demographics that the people And we know from abortion demographics that Black folks make up a disproportionate number of those receiving abortions in this country, that most people who have abortions already have a child or children at home, and that 3/4 of those who terminate their pregnancies are low income. So I want to end with a story that is a story that's not about abortion, but that also speaks to history, which again, I think is so important here. Now, it's a story that some of you no doubt have heard before, and maybe multiple times from me because I use it a lot, but I feel like it's a really important one. And so I don't tire of sharing it. It's a story about the Ralph sisters, 3 young Black sisters who were living with their parents in Montgomery, Alabama in 1973, Katie, Mary Alice, and Minnie. The 2 youngest girls were developmentally disabled, Mary Alice and Minnie. Now, this family was receiving services from a family planning clinic that was part of a larger organization that ultimately was funded by the federal government. And for a very long period of time, the people at that clinic were involved in what I could only describe as very disturbing ways in the healthcare that these 3 young women were receiving, including getting an IUD for the oldest daughter, although she never asked for it, and then eventually getting all 3 girls on injectable birth control, which was experimental at the time. And then finally, in 1973, a nurse came to their house, picked up Mrs. Ralph and her 2 youngest daughters, Mary Alice and Minnie, who were 14 and 12 at the time. They went to a local hospital, and the nurse asked Mrs. Ralph to sign a consent form, which Mrs. Ralph understood was a consent to continuing the birth control shots that the girls were already taking. She could not read or write, so she simply signed an X on the consent form. She was told to leave the girls at the hospital, which she did. The next morning, doctors administered general anesthesia to Minnie and Mary Alice and surgically sterilized both girls. This is an abusive, of course, use of sterilization against 2 poor Black girls, which was a part of sterilizations conducted in public hospitals or by healthcare providers who were otherwise receiving federal assistance for decades in this country. Fannie Lou Hamer, the civil rights activist, used to refer to these as Mississippi appendectomies because they happened with such frequency. Eventually, the Southern Poverty Law Center got involved. There was a lawsuit filed. The federal government settled it. And the rules that we see now about informed consent and wait times for sterilization actually grow out of that reality. And the creation of these procedural safeguards was critical, but sadly, as we know, it remains the case that sterilization practices, especially when it comes to poor women or women of color, are often not fair or neutral. Now, I shared the Ralph story in detail because I think it's really vital as we have this conversation to again take note of the ways in which reproductive oppression and reproductive hierarchies have deep intersectional implications. For the Ralph sisters, it was the combination. It wasn't just being Black, it wasn't just being female, it wasn't just being developmentally disabled, and it wasn't just being poor that led to their unconsented sterilization. It was all of those categories and identities coming together. These were bodies, families, people who the state did not want to see replicated. And stripping them of the ability to become pregnant was not about protecting autonomy or dignity. It was the exact opposite of that. Mississippi appendectomies are a quintessential example of the ways in which a focus on protecting a right to avoiding pregnancy can leave other women and girls vulnerable to deeply abusive practices. Right now, we are living through an extraordinary time that tragically highlights how ordinary oppression is in this country, but that I hope also gives us a moment to act with great clarity and potentially with great unity. I think that right now we are all really challenged to stand against ignorance and discrimination and oppression because reproductive justice demands that we recognize, to paraphrase Audre Lorde, our freedom depends on removing the shackles from others, even if they are very different from our own. So I'm going to stop there for Q&A, and then I'll have a couple of thoughts to wind down.
Thank you so much, Kim. That was amazing. And Kim is always such a fantastic speaker, even when she's had a cold and been too sick to travel. So thank you so much. And also thank you for giving us some sense of hope, because we've had a lot of scary thoughts today, but you've given us a lot of ideas of how we could move forward and maybe have a better world. So let's take some questions. All right, we've got somebody in the back. You're going to definitely need to use the mic because I suspect she won't hear otherwise.
Yeah, I won't be able to hear without the mics.
Do I need to identify myself or just?
Feel free, sure.
Never mind. This may be a provocative question, so bear with me. I've seen a lot of the statements from the anti-choice zealots, and one of the statements I've seen is the most dangerous place for black babies is their mother's womb. So I'd like to know how you feel that these anti-choice zealots desire to force more poor women and girls, many of them African American, to bear more poor children advances the causes of white supremacy. And wouldn't it be more logical that ethno-supremacists would want to see fewer of, rather than more of, the persons they don't favor in society? Thank you.
So that was a big billboard campaign several years ago, right? The idea that phrasing that you used, which is, offensive on a million different levels, obviously. So look, I don't think that you can just sort of walk into, a meeting filled with people who describe themselves as pro-life and say, hey, listen, there's probably some things that we agree on. Let's sit down and talk. Right? I mean, I think that would be bold, but not necessarily wildly productive. What I do think, though, is that there are people who sincerely recognize that there are overlapping issues that we both care about. Right? Not everybody in that movement, but enough people where you could actually create coalition. Would it necessarily be a fun coalition? I don't know, maybe not. But to the extent that there are people who have power with their state legislatures, people who sort of, talk the talk of the folks who have the reins of power in their jurisdictions, it behooves us to be able to take advantage of that where we can.
Okay, I think why don't we, since we can move the mic down that direction since we're already halfway here.
Thank you. That was fantastic. I have a question about the future. If Roe was as we know, an inadequate law, what should the regime be that would extend protection across all people for all pregnancy options? When will that bill be introduced?
Is that Tracy?
Yes, that is.
I'll answer the last part first, right? When will that bill be introduced? And I think probably when Congress is filled with folks from Gen Z, right? I don't think we're going to get there with the people who we have now. But I think what it would look like is obviously it would have to be a package that said, abortion is legal. That's certainly a starting point. But I think the broader conversation is a conversation where we would say, listen, what are the things that we value as a country? If we value children, if we value families, if we value pregnancies, then what do we have to do in order to reflect the fact that we value those things? And so it means that you have to have things like, the medical care is just the obvious part of it. The contraception, the abortion, the prenatal and postnatal care. That's the easy part of it. The harder part of it is the nutrition. The harder part of it is making sure that people live in safe housing. The harder part of it is making sure we have affordable childcare. And we live, as others have said, we live in a country that cares very deeply about privatizing family. The government doesn't want to pay for its future workers, and that's unfortunate. So I do think, and I have a 15-year-old and a 17-year-old who, they and their friends often see the world differently and have different expectations of the world than some of us old folks do. And so I'm putting a lot of pressure on them. And I do tell them things like this all the time. I'm like, it's up to you, which is probably a lot for a 15-year-old and a 17-year-old. But unfortunately, I think it's true. I think that we have such an entrenched system right now of people who are incredibly abusive of the power that they have. And it's going to take us a while to get rid of them, unfortunately.
I say the same thing to my kids.
Yeah.
David.
Hi, Kim. It's David Cohen. Good to see you. So I'm curious, when you list the things we need to be striving for, we have places in the country that are really doing some wonderful things in that regard, right? Some states, some cities, right? Like we've got some cities that are experimenting with universal income, right?
Yeah.
And just giving people money who need it. The problem is, we've got other parts that are going the complete opposite direction. And so I feel like, how do we nationalize? How do we get to a point? The value of Roe was that it nationalized a baseline, right? And that's what's missing when we have some really good things happening that do, like when you're in New Jersey and you look at a lot of good things New Jersey's doing, it's got its faults, right? But it's doing some really cool things. But other parts are doing the complete opposite. And we've got such polarization on policy, not just on views. So how do we get to nationalizing? And maybe it's the Gen Z answer you were just giving, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, I do think that there are some spaces where you might be able to cross the aisle a little bit, right? I do think that there are people in Congress who don't want us to have the highest maternal mortality rate of the developed world, right? Maybe they don't feel so great about that. That might be a space where you could say, listen, let's at least not be at the bottom of the list. Let's at least do a little bit better on something like that. And so I think that there's no way that we're going to get a full agenda, certainly not on a federal level. It's just not going to happen. Congress isn't going to do it. I'm terrified of anything that goes in front of the Supreme Court at this point. Like, I don't trust any of those people. No, I shouldn't say any of them, most of them, as far as I could throw them. So that's really scary. So I think we do have to be thinking about sort of small wins federally, and really just trying not to get pushed back even more on a federal level. And I know you and I might disagree a little bit about that. Like, I worry about taking things up that you then lose, because I think the consequences can be really serious. So yeah, I think we can do more piecemeal things on a federal level. And then on a state level, that's where we really have to do some pushing. And there's a lot that's involved with that. Some of it's going to be the constitutional claims that people are making in their various jurisdictions. We saw some really interesting things happen with the last midterm election, places that you wouldn't think, right? Deciding that abortion should be protected in their jurisdiction. That was huge. And some of that work requires an enormous amount of on-the-ground presence and on-the-ground work. It is door-to-door. It is talking to people in grocery stores. It is an incredible amount of personal focus in order to achieve some of those things. And you're not going to be able to get that in every state. But if you can do it in Kentucky and if you can do it in Kansas, then there got to be some other places where we can do it too, but not Congress.
All right, I think yes, go ahead.
All right, hi.
Hi.
Hannah. Thank you for calling out the DC Abortion Fund. I appreciate you. As a Black Gen Zer in the room, I was like, y'all can't be talking about my generation without me speaking up. But I guess like something that is looming for me this week in the back of my mind is the fact that the Supreme Court is supposed to rule supposedly on Tuesday about the possibility of the forgiveness of student debt, right? And we know Black and brown people are twice as likely to drop out of college, to have student debt with only, without finishing their college degrees. How does that play a role in economic justice, right? So I think one thing for consideration, I'd love to hear your opinion on it, is the possibilities around more coalitions around poverty-based things. Because growing up in like small town Virginia, like I was one of the only Black people in my class, but I was 75% of the poverty like in my class. All of us were impoverished. And so I think that is really like a thread that we can utilize to our advantage on a national level. But something that's worrying is obviously the current court ruling against forgiveness.
Yeah. So I think that I think that we are in, and again, I'm trying to wear this hat of optimism that doesn't really fit very well on my head, but I'm doing my best here. I do think that we are in a moment where there are people who are energized who were not energized before. There are people who are scared who were not scared before, and fear can be a really powerful driver. And there are people, particularly on state levels, again, who I think have enormous capacity for organizing that is deeply, deeply impressive. And we've seen that, play itself out in some really powerful ways. So I do think that it's got to be, because I don't trust Congress and because I don't trust the Supreme Court at this point, I do think it's a lot of sort of individual legwork. And the student loan issue has been, I think, a great equalizer might not be the right word, but it has created a sense of community across groups that I think could end up being helpful. So I think the real challenge, and I'm not an organizer, right? Like I'm an academic and I'll show up for people's things and do things that I'm told. But I think that the people who are good at it have an incredible ability to harness that kind of power across different types of silos, right? So we might not agree on, say, criminal justice reform, but we do agree on student loan forgiveness. And we might not agree about, access to abortion, but we do agree that babies are important. And so, we should make sure that pregnant people get access to prenatal care. So I think that there's got to be a lot of that sort of, and I think it can be hard work, right? Because when there are fundamental things that are big and important to you that you disagree with somebody about, you don't necessarily want to sit in a room with them. But I think a lot of us are going to have to get more comfortable with that in order to achieve the things that we're trying to achieve.
Any other comments or questions? Yes. It's going to take a minute for the mic to get over to him. I don't know if you can see. You can't see the audience, can you?
No, I can't see.
So
no.
The mic's traveling.
Professor Mutcherson, thank you so much for this incredible talk. My name is Callum Baker. And on the previous panel, I used the phrase bodily autonomy as kind of a touch phrase or something that I keep going back to describe how all of these issues are knit together. I think reproductive justice is really a much more powerful frame, and I am trying to figure out how to bring more of those concepts into broader discussions related to healthcare, because I think it's the components of reproductive justice that affect not just reproductive health, but all of health, I think are fairly clear, but also I'm not sure are well represented by those of us who are trying to draw those connections and say, what is it across healthcare, health and healthcare, that we're trying to talk about in relation to having the opportunity to make decisions about our own bodies and families and communities and lives. Do you have any suggestions or frameworks that you're familiar with that kind of explicitly link the reproductive justice framework to broader health and healthcare conversations in ways that doctors and others may be more familiar with?
Well, I mean, as I said in the beginning, I really think that the power of reproductive justice, if you sort of look at its multiple tenets, is that it is really so broad, right? In ways that some people criticize it for, right? That it's asking too much and it demands too much of us. So I think by its very terms, it is a concept. And of course, reproductive justice was a movement, right? It's not an academic theory. And And it was a concept that was a way to say, how can we bring together all of these things that we are seeing in our communities that allows us to build a movement, and a movement that has multiple tentacles, but that all come back to the same sort of idea, right? Which in many ways is really just about, I hate to use the word personhood, but it's really about the personhood of Black people, right? About being a Black person in a country that for centuries didn't think you were a person at all. And then to the extent that you are a person, that you are not a person of value, and sort of, trying to work around that. So, I'm a law school professor, but I have had the joy and privilege, I would say, of doing a lot of teaching in medical schools. And I think it's really powerful sometimes for medical students to get this opportunity to hear from another discipline, somebody sort of saying to them, there's an enormous amount of responsibility in your hands. And I want you to be thinking about that as a medical student, not just when you become a doctor. I want you to be thinking about the language that you use. I want you to be thinking about the biases that you bring into a patient's room. I want you to be thinking about how your legal obligations can have an impact on the relationship that you are able to forge with a patient. So I think that reproductive justice gives you all of that space. And it's just a function of figuring out how you want to use it and how you're comfortable using it in an academic setting.
Great. Do we have any more questions? Yes. Okay. Michael, at the other end of the room.
Hi. Yeah. So I was wondering if this is trying to be optimistic, which doesn't really work well for me either. Think of, is this an opportunity to not just, highlight reproductive justice in terms of bringing other people kind of under that tent, but pulling reproductive justice to other areas, right? And so going off of the last question, one of the things that I've been thinking about since the event at BU Law and at Radcliffe is, I presented last fall at Harvard on trans rights and bans on gender affirming care. And I was struck by really smart people who care about this saying, oh, you're going about this the wrong way, right? You have to frame this as a parental rights issue that triggers heightened scrutiny and whatever, right? You need to, frame this as regulating, the medical profession, right? And so to me, it also seems like racial or reproductive justice, it's also about looking backwards and learning, right? And so part of, the problem with Roe and Casey is the extent to which it wasn't centering the people who should have been centered from the beginning, right? And so when we think about trans rights and that fight, which is, happening, we should not, frankly, make it a parental rights issue, right? We shouldn't make it a physician rights issue or a patient-doctor, right? It should be the individual, right? We need to center the person. And so I wonder to what extent, I'm trying to think about this in terms of Second Amendment and gun violence, right? And all of these other areas, and so sort of taking it to these other places and using kind of, how we got from Roe to Dobbs. I feel like reproductive justice shows us that to some extent. Let's not make the same mistake, not only in terms of reproductive justice, but in these other areas.
Yeah. I think that's a really, really difficult question because it is that question about, I talk about this with my students a lot, right? Like your job as a lawyer in many ways is to win. And so you make the arguments where you can win based on what the law is, right? But in so doing, you are potentially perpetuating a set of circumstances that is not the set of circumstances that you think should be perpetuated. I think that's a really tough position to be in. And we see it all the time with, impact litigation. Like think about all the marriage equality cases, right? That were like, the worst thing in the world is to not be married. Oh, thanks. Right. So I think that there's, that the law as a tool for change is on one hand incredibly powerful, and on the other hand, deeply conservative. And I'm not quite sure how we get past that, particularly when, you know, you're sitting and you're staring at somebody who needs a remedy now, and you know that you can make an argument that a court is going to embrace that allows this person to get what it is that they need. So I feel like, you know, I am partially not a great person to answer this question because my imagination has been, you know, bound by being a lawyer and a law professor. But I think that there are other sorts of, and this is, you know, sort of goes to the interdisciplinarity that I think is so important in these conversations, that there are other ways of thinking about how do you change sort of hearts and minds, which is different from how do you change the law, I think, or at least sometimes can be.
Do you have some final rousing words for us? Or was that the last of the optimism we could get from you?
Well, I don't know if there are final rousing words, but there's this quote from Dorothy Roberts that I just absolutely love. And the quote is, "The thing about reproduction is that more than anything else, it tells us how a society values people." And I think that's so powerful. And it's so true, right? So saying to somebody, you shouldn't have children, or we don't want more people like you in the world is an incredible way of saying you're no good, or you're not useful to us. And I want us to be able to, and obviously I'm very interested in reproduction, so it's important to me, but I think that quote from Dorothy, I think, is a really useful way to sort of think about why working within a reproductive justice framework is potentially so powerful, right? Because it really is reflective of all of these ways in which our country's history has shown not just disdain, but, you know, hatred for so many different people. And that's just not the way that we have to live. And we're really at this place now where I think we get to make some real decisions, right? About, you know, about privacy, about whether it is a right or a privilege, about who gets to decide what kind of families they build, about who gets to decide whether they have children and how they raise their children. And I think it's really easy in a moment like this to feel incredibly paralyzed, right? There's so much that is going on right now. And so what I really hope is that, you know, people who care about these issues, people who care about reproductive justice, that we can be supportive of each other in this moment where it's so easy for us to just sit back and say, well, you know, what are we going to do? We've lost the Supreme Court. We've lost Congress. Well, we haven't lost Congress, but might as well, right? You know, what are we going to do about this? And so I believe very deeply in the power of righteous anger. And I think there's a lot of righteous anger out there right now. I believe very deeply in the importance of recognizing the places where you can find allies. And I think there are lots of allies out there right now who need to really be brought in. I believe that it is important for us to amplify the voices of the people who are most vulnerable, right? Usually when we say, you know, I want to be a voice for the voiceless, it's not that those people are voiceless, it's that nobody's listening to them. So what are the ways in which we can use and wield our power to help amplify those voices? And ultimately, I think we just have to believe that better is possible, right? And that can be the hardest thing on any given day, to believe that better is possible. And it is hard to believe that. And I'll go back to my kids again, right? That I can't raise them in a world in which I think it's all just going to get worse. I have to believe that we can, over time, incrementally, and as people who actually care about other people, that we can build a better America and ultimately build a better world. So that's a story I keep telling myself. And you do it in large ways and small ways, but you try to do it every single day. And that's the conversation I always have with myself.
Thank you so much. It's almost as if you were here with us today. So I hope you feel better. And I know everybody's eager to go, but if you will please just indulge me for a minute to thank the many people who allowed this day to happen. So first of all, thank you to all of our wonderful speakers, both yesterday and today. It's been incredibly stimulating. My brain's just kind of, overflowing with ideas and things to think about. I have a lot of people at GW to thank for making sure that the day went smoothly. Deb Gales, who was so helpful in so many ways. She's our event organizer. We really couldn't have done it without her. Our wonderful IT team, Matt Bokniak, but especially Megan McEntee, who gave us all of her time today on a Saturday. Maria Ilturralde, who had wonderful catering, and her team was working very well with us all day today. Gail Bell and Scott Pagel for helping us access and use the Trasher Great Room, our communications and marketing department, and our facilities and GW security department. So a round of applause for everybody. Thank you so much.